Do you like books? I mean, really, really like books? Then you're in the right place. Each week, your host, Sam Hankin, interviews the best of today's top-selling authors and the up-and-coming superstars of modern literature. This is the Avid Reader. Here is your host, Sam Hankin.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Avid Reader. Today, our guest is Philip Goff, whose latest book, his second, is Galileos Error, Foundations for a New Science of Consciousness, published in November last year by Pantheon. His first book, by the way, was Consciousness and Fundamental Reality. He's a philosopher and consciousness researcher at Durham University in the UK. Galileo's Error is centered on the idea of panpsychism, a construct, if you will, that consciousness is fundamental and all-encompassing and threads its way throughout the entire universe. Even Philip admits that this idea sounds a little bit crazy. The idea that even the most constituent particles of nature, electrons, quarks, gluons, retain a certain very simple ability, characteristic of self-awareness, if you will. And I may be misstating this theory somewhat, but I don't blame myself. I blame the concept. One, I may be too ignorant to grasp the concept. Two, the possibility that all of what Philip posits is wrong. So with that somewhat mean-spirited introduction, welcome, Philip, and thanks for being with us today.
Thanks very much. Good to be here. That was a really nice introduction. Thank you.
So what's wrong with my recitation of what panpsychism is?
I think you got it about right. I mean, maybe one thing, the word consciousness, it's a little bit ambiguous and people mean different things by it. And some people mean something quite sophisticated like awareness of your own existence, self-awareness. I think you use that term there. And that's something pretty sophisticated that we might be reluctant to ascribe to many non-human animals like rabbits, for example, never mind fundamental particles. But that's not what we mean by consciousness in this context. All we mean really is subjective experience, pleasure, pain, visual or auditory experiences. Now, human experience is incredibly rich and complex. It's, what you get after millions of years of evolution by natural selection. The experience of a horse is much simpler. The experience of a mouse is simpler, and as we keep getting down to simpler and simpler forms of life, we get simpler and simpler forms of experience. Now, maybe that stops somewhere and the lights of consciousness switch off, but according to panpsychism, the idea is we keep getting simpler and simpler forms of experience, going right down to the basic building blocks of the universe, perhaps fundamental particles like electrons and quarks. So that's the view. Of course, why you'd believe that is another question, but that's the basic idea. Yeah.
The other interesting thing, and it's kind of synchronicity, which is kind of an aspect of all this, is that 2 weeks ago I interviewed Donald Hoffman on The Case Against Reality. 2 weeks before that, I interviewed Michael Graziano on Rethinking Consciousness.
Right.
This is the third one, and I'm so confused because everybody has a slightly different viewpoint. And then I watched all the different YouTube videos of you and Philip Pullman, which was wonderful. I love him.
Right. Yeah.
Such a gracious man. But yeah, so these three now, I have them rolling around in my head. And I guess so, here you go. They all do this, and you do it too. Consider the apple.
Consider the apple.
Yes. And from Newton onward. I mean, and Donald Hoffman talks about, okay, here's the apple, here it is, it's red, it's this size, it's this far away.
Yeah.
So take off from there. Is that, and you talk about the illusionists. So,
Yeah. So, I mean, one thing, I mean, I'd say my position is quite close to Donald Hoffman's in some ways. I think, there's certain similarities, although I think the advantage of the panpsychist view I defend is I think it stays a little bit closer to the standard scientific story than Hoffman's picture does. But maybe we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves. Yeah, so I think we both draw inspiration from the revolution Galileo brought about, the intellectual revolution Galileo brought about at the start of the scientific revolution. You know, we think of Galileo as a great experimental scientist, and of course he was, but he was also a great philosopher, and he radically rethought our philosophical picture of the world. Because before Galileo, people thought the world was full of qualities. So you look at your apple, the greenness of the apple was out there on the surface of the apple. The taste of it was literally inside the apple. Or if you're eating something spicy, the spicy taste is inside the paprika or whatever. Smells, there are smells floating through the air. So that was the picture of the universe, this quality-filled universe. But Galileo said, well, I want a mathematical science. I love mathematics. I want to completely capture the physical world in mathematics. But then this was a problem if you have all these qualities, because as Galileo understood, you can't really capture these qualities in the purely quantitative language of mathematics. You can't capture the greenness of green or the spiciness of paprika in an equation. So Galileo said, right, well, you know, if we want a mathematical science, we have to get rid of those qualities. So he proposed a radically new philosophical theory of reality, according to which the qualities aren't really out there in the physical world, rather they're in the consciousness of the observer. So the greenness of the apple, or maybe you're looking at a red apple. No, you said a green apple, didn't you? It's not really out there on the surface of the apple. It's in the consciousness of the person looking at it. The spiciness of the paprika isn't really in the paprika. It's in the consciousness of the person eating it. So Galileo, as it were, strips the physical world of its qualities, so that once he's done that, all that remains are the purely quantitative mathematical characteristics: size, shape, location, motion, things we can capture in mathematical geometry. So in Galileo's worldview, there's this radical division between on the two domains: the quantitative domain of science, the physical world with its mathematical properties, and the qualitative domain of consciousness with its qualities of colors and sounds and smells and tastes. So this is the start of mathematical physics, and it's gone really well. But I think it's gone so well, what we've forgotten is that it was never intended to be a complete story of reality. In fact, the whole project was premised on putting consciousness and its qualities outside of the domain of science. And now people are saying, well, we want a science of consciousness. And I think if we want a science of consciousness, we need to find a way of bringing consciousness back into our story of the universe. So Donald Hoffman has one way of doing that. I think we're both on board that there's something missing from our current scientific story. Panpsychism has a slightly different way of doing that. Graziano, in my view, sort of pretends it doesn't exist.
Well,
Yeah.
that's actually he got irritated at me a couple of times. Two questions that he got irritated. One was I talked back from Platonic ideals of Gorgias and the idea of, okay, what about solipsism? In which case, one of us is the universe, and there really isn't any utility in this conversation. But you can't disprove that, nor can you prove that opposite.
Yeah.
You can't disprove solipsism, but there wouldn't be any reason to.
Yeah. I mean, what this brings up well is, I think, one thing, I think the philosopher René Descartes, who was a dualist, he believed in the soul that was outside of the physical workings of the body and the brain. I don't agree with that view. But one thing he famously got right, I think, is that the best consciousness is the thing we know best of all. You know, the physical world, the table. Is there a table in front of me? It seems to be, but maybe I'm in the matrix, you know, maybe it's a figment of my imagination. But am I having an experience of a table? That seems kind of undeniable. It's hard to make sense of the idea that the evil computers in the matrix might be making me think I'm having an experience when I'm not really. So this is related to his famous line, "I think, therefore I am." So it's strange. I mean, I'm inclined to think our current official scientific story of the universe doesn't really have a place for consciousness. And that's kind of really weird, because consciousness is the one thing we're completely certain of. So if anything, I think that should be, as Descartes thought, the foundation for knowledge. But Descartes thought you could get everything from it. He thought we could get around your problem because he thought you could prove the existence of God, and he thought God would never deceive us. So I can trust my sense that there's a table out here. So I don't think Descartes was right about that. I don't think we can get everything from consciousness, but it's a starting point. It's the one thing we're most certain of, and in some sense we should build up all knowledge from that.
Well, if you come at it from the other side, then there's no question in my mind that when I die, you also cease to exist.
I
mean, there's no question that you cease to exist.
That's very self-absorbed of you.
Well, I
yeah.
kind of don't disbelieve in solipsism. The way I feel about it is that before we were born, we're going to be exactly the same as after we die. And we're swimming through this dark blue, warm sea. And then we pop up for a look and we go, what the hell is this? And then you pop back down. And so that goes to the constituency of the universe. Why don't you just say that God is that the universe is totally self-aware, even though that's the wrong word. The universe is totally conscious, and we're just a part of that consciousness.
Well, that's not too far away from the panpsychist story, really. So look, there is this puzzle. How do we fit consciousness into our scientific story of the universe? We know it exists. I think, we know nothing is more evident than the reality of our feelings and experiences, but no one's found a way of fitting it into our scientific story. Despite our great progress in our scientific understanding of the brain, we still don't have even the beginnings of an explanation of how the complicated electrochemical signaling in our brain could produce this in a subjective world of, colors and sounds and smells and tastes. So the panpsychist, so we have to find a way of bringing these two things together, what we know about ourselves from the inside and what science tells us about the body and the brain from the outside. And what panpsychism gives us really is a way of bringing them together. And so the starting point is that physical science doesn't really tell us what matter is. And many people find that a really bizarre claim when you first tell it. You think, you read a physics textbook, you seem to learn all these incredible things about the nature of space and time and matter. But what philosophers of science have realized is that physics, for all its richness, is confined to telling us about the behavior of matter, what it does. Think about what does physics tell us about an electron? It tells us it has mass and charge. And these characteristics are completely defined in terms of behavior. Things like attraction, repulsion, resistance to acceleration. Physics tells us what an electron does, but it doesn't really tell us what it is. So in a way, there's this big hole in the center of our scientific story of the universe. The proposal of the panpsychist is to put consciousness in that hole. So the idea is there's just matter, nothing spooky or supernatural, maybe just particles and fields, but matter can be described from two perspectives. Physics describes it, as it were, from the outside. It tells us about its behavior, but matter from the inside is constituted of consciousness. So it's this beautiful way of bringing together in a single unified story what we know about ourselves from the inside, our feelings and experiences, and what what physics tells us about matter from the outside. So I think, in contrast, coming back to Donald Hoffman, I think he wants to say our current scientific story is wildly off. It's grounded in, not wildly, it's grounded in some more fundamental story. The advantage of the panpsychist story is you say, science is absolutely fine as it is, anything, but science just tells us what stuff does. It doesn't tell us what it is. So we need an answer to the question what stuff is, and that's the place we slide consciousness into. So it's a perfect theory. Perfect solution.
Well, you've decided to write a book. Your first book kind of wasn't, but this book is, I don't want to say, I mean it in a good way, popular science. It's accessible to readers with some intelligence.
Yeah.
And so if that's the case, though, a lot of readers are going to come into this. And I asked this, Donald Hoffman was gracious about this. Graciano was not so gracious about this. I said to him, so is there a ghost in the machine? And he goes, no, there isn't. That was it. So, but yours, and Hoffman was much more amenable to it. But to me, as your reader, as one of your readers, it sounds almost like panpsychism is the idea that there is a kind of ghost in the machine.
Well, when you the phrase "ghost in the machine," that's from the philosopher Gilbert Ryle, and this was his way of talking about, in his mind, a mocking way about dualism, right?
Yeah.
The view that the soul is outside of the physical workings of the body and the brain. And yeah, I suppose I do worry about that view. Look, I mean, I have a very open mind, and it's very early days in the science of consciousness, and we should be open to all views. But I think there are worries to that view. If you think consciousness is outside of the body and the brain, we have these famous problems about how they interact, because we know that consciousness stands in a very close causal relationship with the brain. If you start to feel anxious, you might start to sweat, or your heart rate will go up. If someone sticks a knife in you, you'll feel pain. The mind and the brain stand in this very close relationship. And the problems for dualists is always to make sense of that. If there were an immaterial soul impacting on our brain every second of waking life, you'd think that would really show up in our neuroscience. There'd be all sorts of things happening in the brain that had no physical explanation. It would be like there was a poltergeist playing with the brain, and that's really not what we seem to find. So the advantage of panpsychism is you don't have the separation. In a way, the panpsychist view is there's just consciousness, and physics. What physics does is tell us what consciousness does. So to return to the ghost in the machine, it's more like the machine is just what the ghost does. Really, there's just the ghost, and when we think of it as a machine, we're just thinking of what the ghost does. So for the panpsychist, matter is what consciousness does.
But then, and you discussed this. Well, actually, Philip Pullman was talking about the Higgs boson and fields. But if you're talking about Heisenberg's principle of uncertainty, or the double slit experiment, then it's the observer. And once the object is observed, you're obviously changing the intrinsic properties of the object. So then that kind of counters the idea of, it goes back to a duality. These things don't exist, or their acceleration doesn't exist. And one of the reviews of your book started out with, again, the cliche, if a tree falls in the forest.
Yeah. Well, I mean, quantum mechanics is probably the only thing that's more mysterious than consciousness, perhaps. So I talk about this in a chapter in my book that's called "Is There a Ghost in the Machine?" And so there is this mystery. I mean, as quantum mechanics is taught to physics undergraduates, what they tell you is, there's one equation, Schrödinger's equation, that governs when no one's looking. And then something else happens when you make a measurement. We have what's called collapse of the wave function, and then the Born rule kicks in. Right? That's how it's taught. That's how the trouble is, what the hell is going on there? Why does, when you make an observation, make a difference? This was famously captured in the Schrödinger's cat thought experiment, right? That the cat's in the box, when no one's looking, it's both alive and dead. You open the box and have a look, it becomes either definitely alive or definitely dead. And actually, from the early days, certain people said, look, well, this fits really well with dualism. the idea that consciousness is non-physical. So maybe it's non-physical, it's the interaction with non-physical consciousness that makes the difference. So when the cat's in the box and no one's looking, Schrodinger's equation rules, then you open the box, non-physical consciousness gets in there and collapses the wave function, as they say. So that's been a view that's always been there. It's not been taken that seriously, but actually, I guess people just thought, oh, souls are spooky, that's not real science. But actually, the philosopher David Chalmers and his co-writer, philosopher of physics Kelvin McQueen, have actually written a paper recently really trying to rigorously work this view out. They're not convinced it's right, but they're like, let's try and work out the details. Let's see if it works. This is going to be in a Oxford University Press volume on consciousness and quantum mechanics that I've also got something in. So that's
what I have behind me are all the brief introductions. I have every.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, fantastic.
You should do one of those.
I love those books. Yeah, I've thought of that actually.
You can put them in the back pocket of your jeans and just walk around.
Yeah, they're fabulous. I really like the design of the covers as well.
Yeah, so do I.
Just to finish off though, I would say that's not the only option on quantum mechanics. There are numerous interpretations of quantum mechanics. Probably the most popular among philosophers of physics is the many worlds interpretation, which Sean Carroll has recently defended. And the reason people like that, you think it sounds really extravagant, but the reason people like it is you don't get collapse of the wave function at all. Right. And so you don't need to worry about observers making a difference. My own view, I prefer the Bohmian view, where you have the wave function and you have particles. So there are various options on quantum mechanics. So nobody really knows what the hell is going on there. But you're right that the dualism does fit well with that particular interpretation of quantum mechanics, where consciousness plays a role in collapsing the wave function.
I don't want to go off on too many tangents, but what you're saying about parallel universes is that we do have all the time in the world, and we do have all the space in the world. So there's no reason why every nanosecond we have split off during this conversation into as many different universes as you can imagine. Yeah. Forget about that. But the one thing. No. Yeah. The one thing you and Philip Hillman got into, not get into, but you discussed, was the opposite of the ghost in the machine, which is this idea of the zombie.
Yes. Yeah. So, well, this is a philosophical creation of thought experiment. A zombie is defined as an atom for atom physical duplicate of a human being, but which has no consciousness. There's nothing that it's like to be a zombie. So you stick a knife in it, screams and runs away, but it doesn't actually feel pain. Or if it's crossing the road, it'll look carefully both ways for the traffic to stop, but it doesn't actually have any visual or auditory experience of the world around it. So it's just a sort of complex mechanism set up to behave like an ordinary human being. So nobody believes these things are real. Almost no one, I don't think. But the problem is that they seem to be conceivable. They seem to be logically. There doesn't seem to be any contradiction in the idea of a zombie. And this kind of really points in the direction of that. I mean, it's really a long-winded way of pointing to the fact that, I mean, still probably the most popular view in this area is materialism, is that we can somehow explain consciousness in terms of the physical workings of the brain. But the problem there is that physical science works with a purely quantitative vocabulary, whereas consciousness, as Galileo well understood, is a qualitative phenomenon. It involves qualities like the redness of a red experience, the smell of coffee, the taste of mint. And you just can't capture these qualities in the purely quantitative vocabulary of physical science. And so as long as your description of the brain is framed in the purely quantitative description of neuroscience, you're always going to leave out these qualities and hence leave out consciousness itself, really. And the zombie really gives us a way of kind of making concrete sense of that, because it seems to make perfect sense to imagine something that duplicates us in all quantitative respects, but misses out these subjective qualities of experience. It's just a way of making that point vivid, really.
Well, it's for me, again, as your reader, and I'm allowed to think whatever I want to as your reader.
You sure are. This
So
is the great democracy of writing.
So to put the finest point that I can on it, and why this is a question I can't answer, is how would you know if you were a zombie or not?
That's an excellent question. That's what Sean Carroll asked me when I was on his podcast, actually. Well, I think, this is another way to press why consciousness is not just another scientific problem. So it's generally agreed now that there is this huge challenge of understanding how consciousness fits into our scientific story. But many people think, we just need to do more neuroscience and we'll crack it. But one way to see this is just a very different kind of a problem, and maybe our conventional scientific approach isn't really suited to it, is that consciousness is unobservable. You can't look inside someone's head and see their feelings and experiences. Now, we know about consciousness not through observation and experiment, but through our own immediate awareness of our feelings and experiences. If you're in pain, you're immediately aware of that feeling. It's in a way not possible to doubt it. So I think that gives us a very special kind of certainty of the reality of consciousness that is that we can be more certain of it than we can of anything about the external world, really. So I think it's because of that special certainty, that special direct awareness of our own feelings and experiences, that we know we're not zombies. The real question is, how do I know, as we started off, how do I know there's a world out there? I know that I'm conscious, but how do I know there's anything outside of my consciousness?
Well, the other thing that I always think about in terms of, I do mean to say it this way, your presumptuousness, is
That's
that...
Okay, I can take it.
When I was
Throw me everything you got.
All right, when I was 12 years old, at summer camp, I wrote on the wall next to my bunk in magic marker and a Sharpie something like, okay, you have a tool or a meter or oscilloscope and it breaks. And then you attempt to repair the oscilloscope with the oscilloscope. But you can't do that. You have this mind that you are using in order to create this theory, but you're using the very tool that you're attempting to explain. That's what I can't wrap my head around. I really cannot wrap my head around that concept.
What would be a good analogy? It is sort of almost paradoxical, isn't it? The eye turning back on itself. And how do we do this? It's a good it's a good question that's not explored enough. How do we find out about what reality is like? So I think that the standard answer people give these days is science. And what people mean by science is they mean observation and experiments, right? If you can get the theory that can account for all the data of observation and experiments, job done. That's the theory of reality, or our best guess at it. I think, though, the problem, if you religiously stick to that, the only things we believe in are what we know on the basis of observation and experiment, you wouldn't believe in consciousness, because consciousness is not known about in that way. You can't know about it on the basis of observation, looking inside someone's head. In fact, the philosopher Daniel Dennett is wonderfully consistent on this. He says, the only things science should care about is what you can observe. You can't observe consciousness, it doesn't exist. But for most of us, that's kind of crazy. So I think what this shows is really what we need to do to deal with I think we're going through a phase of history where people are blown away by how successful science has gone. And they think, this must be the truth about everything, But I think, in my view, the reason it's gone so well is that it was focused on a quite specific, narrow task, roughly capturing, trying to explain observable data. Whereas there are things that we know about in a different way, such as our own conscious experience. So I think we need to move to a more expansive conception of what science is, We need to find the best theory that it can accommodate both the data of observation and experiment, but also the reality of consciousness that each of us knows through our immediate awareness of our feelings and experiences. And maybe we'll never get there, but there are certain difficulties with it. But we can give it a go, and I think this panpsychist theory seems to have a good stab at it. So, yeah.
What it lacks is perspective. And I remember the closest I can come to understanding consciousness is Pink Floyd's "Comfortably Numb." When I was a child, I had a fleeting glimpse out of the corner of my eye. I turned to look, and it was gone. I cannot put my finger on it now. The child is gone. Yeah, because
lovely stuff.
When I was in college, in various altered states of consciousness, there were moments where I saw you have this incredible insight without any experience when you do drugs or whatever. Yeah. And so I could see exactly what things were. I had moments where I could, with perfect clarity, give you the answer to the questions that everyone is asking. But it doesn't stay. It's ephemeral. But there's a moment where you can do that. Have you ever had those moments?
Yeah, absolutely. Fleeting moments and some sense of a bigger perspective. And I mean, maybe we're back to meaning different words by consciousness here. I mean, maybe this is, I think there are legitimate uses of the word consciousness where we do mean something grander, something that we struggle to get a grip on, and that might be more problematic. But actually, all I'm meaning by consciousness is just really, feelings, pain. So I think, I think we do know what we do have a grip on what pain and pleasure are. So some people say, consciousness is a mystery. People often put it like that. It's a mystery. We don't know what it is. I don't think that's right. I think, nothing is more, you know what a feeling is when you feel it. Nothing is kind of more obvious in a way. Rather, the mystery is how does it fit in to our more general scientific theory of reality? How does, what we know about ourselves on the inside fit in with the scientific story of the electrochemical signaling in the brain? So in a way, actually, consciousness is just pretty mundane. It's just, feelings, pleasure, pain. I think we kind of know what it is.
But the funny thing is that each of you guys who talk about consciousness, there's always part of you that's saying it's not really consciousness. You have it in your title, but it's not. But there's always like a little bit that it's not exactly what. It's not exactly what I'm talking about. It seems to me that way. It seems to me as if, yes, consciousness is as close a word as I can come to what I'm talking about. It's not exactly the word I mean, which goes back to the title of the book. And that's another thing that Graziano got mad at me about. Because the whole time I was talking about the title of his book, which, everybody has a subtitle now. Everybody. Yeah. Rethinking Consciousness, a scientific theory of subjective experience. So the whole talk was just going through parsing his title, and he and I didn't. But
no, I think David Chalmers had this talked about the bait and switch thing that people, in his famous article on this from 1995, people start off these books saying, I'm explaining consciousness, I'm explaining subjective experience, and give examples, what it's like to see red, but then at some subtle point they do the switch and they start talking about something more behavioral that's closely related to consciousness, something like the capacity to monitor your own inner states. And that's something that you can more straightforwardly give a mechanistic explanation of, but it doesn't seem like it's the kind of thing we started off talking about. So there is a lot of that about. I don't think. Well, you might correct me, but I'm open to the. I hope I stay on the subject matter. Whether the theory. I mean, the attacks I get are this sounds like New Age nonsense or something, or just this is crazy to think electrons are conscious. But I don't think many people have accused me of changing the meaning of the word consciousness. Although I'm inclined to agree with you with Graziano that I think he denies the phenomenon that is most evident to us that is more certain than anything else.
And he was very certain of himself as well.
Uh-huh.
There was no wiggle room for me to do what I'm doing with you.
Well, that's no good. Well, no, I mean, I've got a very open. I mean, who knows what the truth is? All we're doing is having our best guess. And actually, my fellow panpsychists sometimes get annoyed with me about this. That I'm even open to the view of my friend Keith Frankish, who thinks, in a certain sense, consciousness doesn't exist, and it's just an illusion our brain plays on us. This is the view called illusionism, and I don't really take that view terribly seriously, but it might end up being the truth. I want people to explore all these options. Who knows what the truth is? So yeah, philosophers tend to talk not in terms of belief, but in terms of the notion of credence, and this is just basically like degrees of belief. So philosophers will often say, what do you think of this view? You'll say, 30% credence, which 20% credence. So I give some credence to all these views. Maybe 5% possibility that illusionism is true. So yeah, I'd probably be more than 50% at the panpsychist view, but who knows? We definitely need to have an open mind, because it's very. I think we're not even thinking about the problem in the right way. So
one of the words that I've always used instead of consciousness, and this was another experience that I had in my college days. One particular night when I was really deep into it, there was this oak tree, and the oak tree and I were essentially talking to each other, but the word was essence. The oak tree was emanating the essence of just oakness. He was just saying over and over to me, oakness. And it was essence. It was the essence of that thing. So sometimes I think, well, essence really is what we're talking about.
Well, it's interesting, yeah. So before the scientific revolution, the dominant paradigm was Aristotle, where each organism did have its own essence, and its essence defined what was good for it and what made it flourish and what its sort of purposes were. And actually Aristotle thought, fire goes up because its essence is to go up to its natural place in the heavens, and whereas the scientific revolution overturned all that and just had this kind of mechanistic picture where things don't really have essences, they're just kind of mechanisms. But actually, it's not that Galileo didn't believe in essences. He just thought you can't get at it scientifically. He was quite clear about this. He said, just focus on what we can capture with mathematics. We can't get at the hidden essences of things. That's just not what we can get at. So in a way, Aristotle sort of set consciousness on one side. It's not that he didn't believe in it. He just thought, we can't get at that with mathematics. So let's just put it outside of the scientific story. If Galileo were to I often say, if Galileo were to time travel to the present day and hear about this problem of explaining consciousness in the terms of physical science, he'd say, of course you can't do that. I designed physical science just to focus on the quantitative and to exclude qualitative consciousness. But so in a way, what the panpsychist story does is, if you think of consciousness as the kind of inner nature of stuff, whereas physical science tells us what stuff does. You can think of consciousness as the inner nature of stuff. The panpsychist brings these together as two sides of the same coin.
Well, it's like let's go back a bit to the title, because the book is on my front table, which doesn't do you any good right now because no one can come into my store. But if they could come into my store, they could buy the book. And I was going to talk, everyone says you can't judge a book by its cover, but every single person who comes into my store judges every book by its cover.
Yeah.
And I love the UK cover because it's Galileo's Error, and then things begin to blur. And it's the blurring, like you had the book cover behind you when you talked to Philip Pullman. And I thought, this is really good. But then I was thinking, okay, you say Galileo's Error. At first blush, it's as if you're saying Galileo was fallible, that he really did make a mistake. And that's what an error is. And all he was doing was saying the same thing as George said, which was nothing exists. And even if something does exist, nothing can be known about it.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a provocative title, but I mean, I've actually got a lot of time for Galileo, who's absolute genius. And in a way, I think he understood things better than us. So, I mean, the error that I'm charging him with is designing science in such a way that consciousness is inherently outside of science. It's inherently mysterious and outside of the scientific story. But, maybe that was necessary for a time while it worked really well, because it was sort of like Galileo said, let's just focus on what we can get a better grip on. He gave scientists a narrow focused task. And I think now at this stage of history, it's gone so well and it's produced this technology that's transformed our planet, and people think, oh, it's everything. But no, it's gone so well because Galileo gave us a very narrow focused task. But I think now at this stage where we do have mature natural science, perhaps it's time to bring consciousness back in and to try and have a theory of reality that it can accommodate both what physical science tells us. I'm not telling physical scientists how to do their job or to do it differently. They do a great job to keep all that as it is, but also to bring back consciousness into our story of the universe, not to stop pretending it doesn't exist. And I think we can do that. So I think Galileo couldn't quite see how to do that, but I think that there is a way of doing it. I mean, it's not my invention, by the way. The inspiration for me is very important work from the 1920s by the philosopher Bertrand Russell and the scientist Arthur Eddington. I think these guys did for the science of consciousness in the 1920s what Darwin did in the 19th century for the science of life. And it's a tragedy that it was forgotten about for so long, but it's recently been rediscovered and is causing a lot of excitement. And this is what I tried to write this book, to try and get these ideas out to a broader audience. So I sometimes put it in the 1620s, Galileo took consciousness outside of science. In the 1920s, Russell and Eddington found a way of bringing it back in again. So,
Russell,
yeah.
That's really great, but Eddington is really cool.
Eddington is great. Yeah, he was a pacifist and a Quaker. And, he was interested in how to reconcile mystical experiences with science. And but yeah, I mean, he was also a keen follower of philosophy. I think sometimes you get things are so specialized now, and you get physicists not understanding philosophy and saying it's all nonsense. But he was a physicist who really understood the importance of science and philosophy working together. I think that's part of what we've forgotten about, and what you need is certainly with consciousness.
But the way you explain it and the way I read it is, it's not so much that it was an error. It's like he said, let's just table this for now.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
And then,
well, yeah. Error is maybe a bit harsh, but I suppose it was an error in the sense that one could in principle have done it differently, so that consciousness was still part of the scientific story. But maybe it was good that he did things the way he did. So yeah.
So what you're doing now is if it was on another table, you're bringing it back.
Yeah, that's the plan.
So it's the hardest thing to do.
Yeah.
And these three books together, it's because, you guys have really screwed me up, because these three books together do not say the same thing. They do not say the same thing.
No, well, so yeah, I mean, what I'm more passionate about, more even than panpsychism, is just we've got to understand this isn't just another scientific problem. And the simple way of seeing it is that consciousness is not observable. Now, science is used to dealing with things that aren't observable. Fundamental particles like electrons can't be directly observed. But in that case, we postulate unobservables in order to explain what we can observe, right? We postulate electrons and quarks to explain as part of the standard model of particle physics that explains so well what we can observe. In the unique case of consciousness, the thing we are trying to explain is not observable. And so that's just a completely different way of thinking about science, and it really constrains how we think about it experimentally. So what I'm keen on is we just really need to completely rethink what science is in order to accommodate consciousness. I think me and Donald Hoffman on that starting point are pretty much on the same page. We both take consciousness as the fundamental starting point. We have different ways of working that out, and who knows who's right. I mean, I'm glad Donald Hoffman's doing what he's doing. I'm doing what I'm doing, and you need lots of different people doing different things. Graziano, as I'm saying, takes a different approach. This approach that consciousness, in the sense that I would, what do you mean by consciousness? People mean different things about it. In the sense that I mean it, he thinks doesn't really exist. And I think people are led that way because they're in the grip of this narrative. Wow, look how well science has done. It's the whole truth, and that can get into your sense of identity, your sense of who you are. It's very reassuring to think humans always think they're at the end of history. We know we don't have all the answers, but we know how to get them. Basically, we've worked it out. But I think there's a different way of looking at the history of science, which is it's gone very well because it was never intended to be the full story. It was always focused on this narrow focused task. So that's what I'm really more passionate about even than the panpsychist view. In my judgment, panpsychism looks to be the best bet, but who knows?
You know how you talk about, like, we even talk about consciousness in the sense of the smallest particles, and then you go up and up and up, and then you go to the mouse and maybe a dog and all that. Do you know? And then you end with human beings. But do you know who I think is the most conscious creature on the entire planet?
Go for it.
The dolphin, because the dolphin cannot manipulate its environment. It has no way of manipulating its environment. So all it can do is think. That's what it can do its entire life.
Right.
So it's like they must know more than anybody.
Wow, that's fascinating. Yeah, I hadn't thought of it that way. Yeah, I mean, there's still so much we don't know about the consciousness of different animals. I mean, an octopus has consciousness not focused in a single part of the organism as we do, but kind of spread out in some sense. What I also wrote in my book in the last chapter is we know so much more about the intelligence of plants and trees in ways we had no idea about before. There's people who found out how to do sort of conditioned learning on pea plants, and how much we've discovered about how trees are connected under the ground and have reciprocal relations of give and take even across species. And so there's still so much we don't understand, I think, about what sophisticated mental creatures not only other animals are, but also even plants. So I'm quite convinced plants are conscious. But
for the first time in this conversation, he used the word intelligence, and Graziano uses that a lot. And so, and I asked, are these machines intelligent? He said, yes, there's no question. And I had never really thought about it before, but they are intelligent. And then I was trying to figure out what the difference between the two. See, if you're talking about the octopus, it's a very intelligent creature.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and really underexplored how we think about the relationship between consciousness and intelligence. Actually, for most of the 20th century, I mean, the dominant view was that intelligence and consciousness are just completely different things. If you look at the dominant theories of thought and intelligence, they just don't mention consciousness. And I think that's how a lot of people think in AI. They think, they're thinking of intelligence completely separate from consciousness. Like the Turing test, if you think about the Turing test, where it's just about the kind of responses a system can give, right? But I think there's actually a growing movement now of people, and I'm one of them, who think that's a great mistake, that actually real intelligence, real understanding, real thought is a kind of consciousness. It's the most sophisticated kind of consciousness. John Searle's famous Chinese room thought experiment tried to press this point. So, no matter how sophisticated a system is, it can behave as though has opinions, as though it has opinions on the climate or the economy or something. But if it doesn't have any consciousness, if it doesn't have any inner life, then it doesn't really understand anything in the most significant, important sense of that word. So I think this gives a completely different take on AI. We've now got to think, not just about what a system can do, but about, is it conscious? If it's not conscious, then in a very real sense, it doesn't have any intelligence.
When Philip Pullman and you were sitting at the table, and he was saying, well, you're not saying that this glass has consciousness, and this glass is talking to the other glass is talking to him while we're having this. That's what it seems like intelligence has. If you're intelligent enough, you have the ability to, as I was saying earlier, step back a bit. Yeah. That's what it means to me, just step back a bit.
Yeah.
There is a commentary. Yes, that's what consciousness really is. It's a commentary. And he talked about that in terms of the novel, and when he used the word sprite instead of God.
Yeah.
There's a certain perspective that you can obtain.
Yeah. I mean, on glasses being, I suppose that's another common misapprehension of panpsychism. It doesn't literally mean everything is conscious, contrary to the etymology of the word. Pan means everything, psyche, mind. It means everything has mind. But panpsychists don't tend to think literally socks and rocks, tables and chairs are conscious. The idea is that the basic building blocks of the universe have incredibly simple forms of experience, and that the human and animal brain, the consciousness of the human and animal brain, is somehow derived from the consciousness of the most basic parts. But it doesn't mean every random collection of conscious particles forms a conscious thing. So we needn't think the table in front of me is conscious. The view is just that it's made up of lots of little things that are conscious. So that's, people still a little bit wacky maybe, but maybe slightly less wacky. But yeah.
Well, in closing out, and we've been speaking for an hour now instead of 20 minutes, but
that's all right.
No, this has been great. I could go on for days. But in closing out, it's so nice, if you want to call what you're doing an occupation, it's so nice to come to it when the area is so dynamic, because it adds so much to your life. I mean, you're involved in something that people, like I said earlier, have untabled. This is now something that everybody is looking to explore. And it's so nice when you come to it at that point, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really exciting. Things have changed so much. For much of the 20th century, consciousness was a taboo topic that it was thought you couldn't do serious science on. And, and 15 years ago, when I finished my PhD, panpsychism was like a joke if it was thought of at all. And well-meaning professors said to me, maybe don't, if you're trying to get a job, maybe don't mention the panpsychism. But it's now gone to be something that's taken very, very seriously. I have graduate students from all over the world coming to work with me on this, and I think what we're finding is scientists and philosophers coming together to lay the foundations for this new approach to consciousness. And so, it's really changing so much so quickly, and it's very exciting. And I think we still need to press for, we've gone from consciousness not being a taboo topic to, I think in the 21st century, it's now accepted that we need a science of consciousness, and it is a serious scientific issue. I think the problem is, though, too many people still think, oh, it's just another scientific problem. We just need to do a little bit more neuroscience and it'll go away. I think people are starting to see now it's not. It's a different kind of problem, and that the conventional scientific approach isn't wholly up to the task. In fact, it wasn't designed for that purpose. It was specifically designed to ignore consciousness. So I think that's what people are starting to see, and it's very exciting.
And the last thing I'll say, because I like to say the last thing, is that it always reminds me of how the Dalai Lama for a long time would meet with quantum physicists every year. And each time he met, Buddhism and the quantum theory became closer and closer together. And it reminds me a little bit of this, because you have this incredibly scientific and incredibly spiritual thing, and they're gradually coming together. And I think I may be wrong about that, but it seems to me that that's similar to what you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, it's bringing together these two stories of the universe that we know to be true. The story of our feelings and experiences, we know that to be true. We also know the scientific story of electrochemical signaling and calcium chambers and neuronal firings is also true. How can they be part of the same truth? Yeah, I mean, it needn't be anything spiritual. I think always keen to emphasize. I mean, to some philosophers like David Chalmers and Luke Roloffs, who are sympathetic to panpsychism, they have absolutely no spiritual inclinations. It's not about anything spiritual. It's just like pain and pleasure. They're real. We need to fit them in. But I suppose if you do independently have certain spiritual convictions, then this is a picture of the universe that's more consonant to that as well. So yeah, so I think and that's why I talk a little bit about in the final chapter of the book. This is a worldview that's, if you for some reason if you took mystical experiences seriously, if you're in a materialist worldview, you've got to think they're delusions, just something funny happening to your brain. But if you're a panpsychist and you already think fundamental reality is constituted of consciousness, then that's a picture of the world that fits better with taking mystical experiences seriously. And so I think there's something right in what you say, although it's always keen to emphasize that that's not necessarily part of what the Panpsychist project is trying to do.
Well, I think that's a good way to end it off, because I think it. I don't mean to say that you're agreeing with what I was saying, but it does set off the two sides very well. And and as I said, I mean, it's a wonderful time to be doing this, because we can explore it from so many different angles, and those angles weren't available before because people simply ignored them.
Absolutely.
So, one, I want to thank you for writing the book, and two, for making the book something that I think it's always nice, whether it's a novel or a science book, that when the reader finishes, that the reader isn't quite sure what's happening, and then the reader can. You allow the reader to continue to go on after the book is closed. I always appreciate it.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, it's been really nice chatting. Thanks for inviting me.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure having you on.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Great, Sam. Nice chatting. See you soon.
We were talking with Philip Goff about his book Galileo's Error, Foundations for a New Science of Consciousness, which is incredible, and he's an incredible guy. Check out a lot of his YouTube videos. If you're interested at all in this concept of why we are who we are and why we're aware of that, it's a great book. And it's really funny because in the past month, I've interviewed Donald Hoffman about his book, The Case Against Reality. You can find a debate between the two of them on YouTube. And then I also did Rethinking Consciousness, a scientific theory of subjective experience by Graziano. So these three books are by three authors who have a completely different viewpoint on what consciousness is. And I've spoken to all three of them, and those three are colleagues, sometimes adversaries, about the nature of whatever you want to call it, essence, awareness, consciousness. Each of them call their books consciousness, but then they kind of backpedal and say it's not the greatest word. But it gets really esoteric and metaphysical, but I think it's well worth listening to all three of them. At least I think that, because I did it. So continue to join us every week during these very strange times. Perfect time for this. And now I've been doing them by Skype or Zoom. Think of all the things you can do. You can do Skype. You can do Skype for Business. You can do Zoom. You can do Teams. Now Google has one. So even though it's a cliche now, this is going to be the new normal. Our book clubs now meet by Zoom, and you can have 100 or 150 people instead of whoever I can stuff into the bookstore. Anyway, so we'll be talking to Elliot Ackerman, whose book Red Dress in Black and White. Sounds like a chick book, but it's not. It's good. And then Robert Sawyer. Oh, shoot, I should have mentioned this to Philip. He's a science fiction author, which I love, and his latest book, The Oppenheimer Alternative, I should have said it, is about human consciousness. So that's 4 of them. Talk about synchronicity. And then debut novelist Margarita Montemor is another science fiction time travel book that at first you think is like going to be all fluff, but then it's like a time travel book that you've never read before. Kind of like a combination of a real scientific one and something like The Time Traveler's Wife. It's called Una Out of Order. So join us for these, and we've got, because, think about it, authors can't do book tours anymore. I can't open my bookstore to sell them books, so they got nothing to do. So as they're sitting around, they can talk to me, and it also helps them sell their books. So in any event, thanks as always for joining us, and we hope you'll be back next week for another edition of the Avid Reader.